We must keep the rate of growth of government spending at reasonable and prudent levels.
Candidate Reagan advocated less government.
We must reduce personal income tax rates and accelerate and simplify depreciation schedules in an orderly, systematic way to remove disincentives to work, savings, investment, and productivity.
Candidate Reagan advocated cuts in federal taxes.
We must review regulations that affect the economy and change them to encourage economic growth.
Candidate Reagan advocated reducing government intervention in the economy.
We must establish a stable, sound, and predictable monetary policy.
Candidate Reagan advocated moderate and stable growth of the economy.
Thank you very much.
And the voters responded by giving candidate Reagan an overwhelming mandate when he was elected president. President Reagan tried to keep his promises, but like most presidents, he was only partly successful. Economist Milton Friedman explains why this occurred. He discusses a political phenomenon, tyranny of the status quo.
Everywhere, whether in the United States, Great Britain, France, or Germany, a new administration has just about 6 months to make major changes that will benefit the community at large. Those changes will have bad effects on small concentrated groups. The bad effects will be visible and immediate. The good effects will be less visible, take longer to manifest themselves, and longer to be recognized. Unless the occupant of that house, Republican or Democrat, makes such changes in the first few months after being elected or re-elected, the tyranny of the status quo will assert itself and prevent further change.
In Tyranny of the Status Quo, we will examine government's potential to act as an agent for change. Joining Dr. Friedman are young adults from throughout the United States. These men and women will share the rewards or suffer the consequences of today's political decisions. Like all of us, they want improvements in our society. Like all of us, they have many different ideas as to how those improvements can be achieved.
The losers are not only the poor, they're the taxpayers as well. As a matter of fact, according to the figures that I've seen, it cost $22,000 per unit to rehabilitate these buildings in 1970. And if you just gave the people the money, you would be able to give them $22,000. And they would surely be able to do better managing their own lives rather than having some bureaucrat in Washington manage their lives like this.
Economist Walter Williams grew up in the slums of Philadelphia.
In one sense, we won the war on poverty, in one sense, but we've lost abysmally the war on independence. That is, we have a number of people around Mott Haven and other places in the country who have television sets, who have telephones, who are receiving reasonable medical care, but they are highly dependent. That is, they are locked in that position for life.
There's a tremendous tyranny of the status quo. And what is right, and people take it for granted. And it's exactly this tyranny of the status quo that makes it so difficult for us to do anything about these things. What happens, as you know, is that every class that gets a benefit gets something for it, regards it as an inalienable right that they're under no circumstances are willing to give up in any way. And that's the difficulty of reforming it.
It seems to me that one of the reasons, one of the components of the dissatisfaction with administrations previous to Reagan, and which led to Reagan's election, was not a total spending question, but a distribution question. The food stamps program, for example, was not passed because the poor are incredibly good lobbyists. It's passed because people in this society in general have a genuine interest in making it possible for everyone in this society to eat. That program also was not passed simply because agriculture wanted it. Agriculture wins regardless of how those people acquire the means to eat. As long as they eat, agriculture wins. The question raised by food stamp programs and a variety of social programs which benefit very small, the lowest sectors of this society, has to do with the distribution of the costs among all sectors of society. And I think that that's an important issue among the American public.
Well, if you look at what the facts are in respect to this, it's extremely difficult to identify the burden on each individual, each class, because so many of our taxes, and not unintentionally, or in a form in which it's hard to know who pays for it. You will hear all the people talking about we have to have taxes on business. But business can't pay any taxes. Business collects taxes on behalf of the government from its workers, from its customers, and from its stockholders. It doesn't pay taxes, it collects them. And so when you take those taxes and say what income classes bore the burden of them, it's an extremely difficult job, but there have been many studies that have been made. And it's a fascinating thing that almost all those studies suggest that the actual burden of taxes is more or less proportional across income classes. Nonetheless, I think you're right, because what matters is not what the facts are, but what the perceptions are. And everybody in the society believes that he's bearing an unfair share of the burden. The low-income people feel that, the middle-income people feel that, and the high-income people feel that.
That's where I think the answer to getting a hold on the budget lies, is in Reagan's undercutting the coalition of opinion makers, or the people that Irving Kristol has called the new class, and the Democratic Party. If Ronald Reagan put the emphasis onto passing a balanced budget amendment, it seems to me that would be a very hard issue to campaign against and a very easy issue to campaign.
If you take for the moment what the facts are on that, the balanced budget amendment that actually was before the Senate and the House was a balanced budget and tax limitation amendment. It got a 2/3 vote in the Senate. It got more than a majority vote in the House, but not a 2/3 vote. So that you can see that there is, and I may say, it got those votes in the Senate and the House, despite the fact that I doubt that there are many senators or House members who really favored it because they think, wrongly, that it reduces their power. And it got that vote only because it was so popular in the public at large.
I'd just like to add a consideration which I think should be taken into account when addressing the balanced budget question. One of the actions that Reagan has taken, or Reagan in conjunct with Congress has taken, which has added to the perception of unequal distribution, was that his tax cuts, in fact, accorded the highest percentage decrease in tax to the highest income bracket.
That's true.
So those kinds of activities don't do anything to alleviate the perception, I think, that's widely held among
You're quite
American
right about
population.
that.
And that has to be addressed before the balanced budget proposal, I think, could...
Well, you're quite right about that perception, but the perception is wrong. And right, it's both. The cut in the top rate from 70% to 50%, undoubtedly, reduced the cost of those taxes to the high-income people. But I believe it increased the revenue received by the government because it reduced the attractiveness of tax shelters.
There are figures on that, by the way, now. It took them a while to come in, but apparently the 70 to 50% cut produced something on the order of a 10% increase in revenue from affected taxpayers.
Well, I think when you look at the core of why we're spending too much outside of what the public really wants, I think it's not the opinion makers that are distorting what the public wants. I think it's the way things are set up. And in theory, what Hamilton, Jay, and Madison said in the Federalist Papers was that opposing factions would counterbalance each other and a compromise would be worked out. But in reality, I think we've seen is that's not what happens. I think there are two different types of things that happen. One is that less powerful factions don't send anybody to Washington, and powerful factions do. So to take an example, tobacco growers send a lobby to Washington. Nobody's going to oppose them, so the congressmen listen to them because they want to make friends with the tobacco growers because they're very powerful. So they give the tobacco growers money. Now the taxpayers don't know anything about it because it only costs each of them $1 or $2. So they don't even read it in the newspapers. Now the second thing...
But you know, it's interesting, before you go on, there is also a lobby that provides that the Surgeon General should spend tax money to discourage people from smoking. Now that's also a special interest lobby. And it's perfectly reasonable in terms of this political view that should be so, because there's a special interest for something. There's a special interest for tobacco subsidies. There's a special interest against tobacco subsidies, and you have to satisfy both.
One solution that's been proposed to the problem of these interest groups being so successful in lobbying is to limit the amount of money that they can contribute to individual candidates' campaigns. And that way, their influence over the political process would be limited, and that way, supposedly, it is argued, the poor and the rich would be able to compete equally effectively or somewhat more effectively. And there are various bills to limit the contributions of political action committees, for example, to individual candidates' campaigns.
Yeah, I think the problem of PACs and special interests are a little bit overstated. I think that PACs are aesthetically undesirable, but they don't have all that much effect, as was shown in the last congressional election, where Nick PAC was basically a failure. I go along with Ben Wattenberg, more or less, in saying that the PACs are a junk mail democracy. You get this thing in the mail, you want to send $25 to whoever, you do it. And special, I don't really understand why liberals, as a matter of course, are opposed to special interest groups, because what's the real difference between a special interest group in Washington and a union in business?
Well, but if we've just agreed that the major political problem is factionalism, then if there's a way of limiting people's ability to form factions, it seems very desirable to go ahead and do that.
There's no doubt it's desirable to reduce factionalism. But the fundamental problem with the kind of proposal you're suggesting, the problem of limiting contributions, is that the real source of factionalism is the fact that the government has enormously valuable grants to give. It has privileges to dispense. As long as there are privileges there to dispense, as long as there's a kind of a governmental gold mine, there will be plenty of explorers going after it. It's like a river. If you block up one channel, it goes another channel. You have to find some way to block up the whole river. What's happened? Why did PACs develop? Because we blocked up certain channels of contributions by individuals, and PACs developed as an offset to that. In my opinion, it's undesirable to have any limit on political contributions by individuals out of their own money. I think there's a great deal to be said that you ought not to let businesses, perhaps, spend money on this way. There are various arguments, but so far as individuals are concerned, it seems to me this is simply a First Amendment proposition that people ought to be free to express their view. If they want to express their view by working for a candidate, manning a telephone bank, and doing the many other things that volunteers do, fine. If they want to express their views by giving them money, fine. But if you but you're not going to succeed in stopping factionalism by blocking up one of these channels. All you're going to do is to direct the ingenuity of the people into finding other ways.
So that instead of trying to change it so that some group can't rig the system, you want to set up a system that can't be rigged at all?
Insofar as possible. I think that the limitations on campaign spending are Band-Aids, and they don't really attack the fundamental problem.
Maybe part of the problem is that the benefits to all of the interest groups which get the spending are very large and are very immediate for them, and they have a tremendous incentive, therefore, to pressure congressmen to vote for those sorts of programs. But the cost of any single program spread out over the taxpayers seems relatively minor, and therefore they may not have a similar incentive to lobby against that particular program.
The question is, how do we alter the system to get rid of this bias, which arises out of the point that Steve is making, that the benefits go to a small, of each program separately, go to a small select group, while the costs are spread widely. And therefore the beneficiaries have more political clout than the recipients. The people who are going to pay the taxes, as you said before, are dispersed and few. Maybe it's going to cost each one $5 extra. Nobody's going to go down in Washington and scream about that $5. And so the problem, the political problem, is how can you get this thing treated as a package in which people can vote on the thing as a whole and then break it down?
In the kind of governmental system that we have, there seems to be a natural tendency toward this, because people who can express their strength at the polls are the ones who are likely to be strongly benefited by something. And it's always been the case, I think, in democracies of unlimited power, that the greatest concern has been a certain segment of the population just going out and voting itself benefits.
One thing which might improve the situation would be if we restructured the incentives for the federal legislative process so that congressmen, when they voted on these bills, would be able to take into account the problems of the incentive to spend. And one way of doing that would be to set an overall cap on spending that would force congressmen to apportion a fixed amount of the national income instead of having the possibility of constantly letting spending increase. Another possibility might be to have an item veto or a 2/3 requirement for passing appropriations or tax bills.
Well, it's interesting, if you go back to the Federalist Papers and the Founding Fathers, they were very much concerned about the problem of faction. They were concerned exactly about this kind of a problem. And it was in that conception that they were interested in having a system of checks and balances, and particularly in leaving power with the separate states on the grounds that the possibility of one state doing that was much more limited than the possibility of the society as a whole doing it. And of course, one of the things that has facilitated the movement we've had has been the centralization of power in the federal government. And one of the things, again, it's interesting, one of the things that Mr. Reagan was very strongly in favor of was a new federalism which would turn more power back to the states, and that too has made no progress.
We live in a global economy, and we need a national policy to protect our industrial base, not for protectionism, as they talk of it, not for doing away with an uncompetitive situation, but rather taking the Japanese practices, let's say, translating them from Japanese into English.
We ought to move into those countries and challenge the causes of revolution, challenge the hunger and the poverty and the repression, and line up with the genuinely revolutionary forces that merely want democratic institutions and human rights.
Of all the candidates for president, I've had the most experience and background in trade. I'm committed to a more open international competitive environment, but I also know what's going on.
As voters, we have heard it all before, and yet we approach each election with new hope. Surely, this time, the candidate whom we elect will give us what we want. Why is it easier to get what we want when we buy something in the marketplace than when we elect a candidate? For example, more and more people decided to reduce their caffeine consumption, and suddenly there were caffeine-free colas on all the grocery shelves. Will we ever get that kind of service from our government?
How can the entire citizenry be the master of their circumstances under a socialist government?
It's democratic socialism.
Well, you have 51% of the people vote for one thing and 49% vote for the other. Are the 49% who voted against it masters of their own destiny?
Nor am I going to defend the efficiency of democracy. But as Winston Churchill says, it's better than anything else.
Well, maybe for those things for which you have to have a single decision. Yeah. But isn't it far better to have a world in which the 51% can get what they vote for and the 49% can get what they vote for?
The question is whether that kind of a world is possible.
Right.
Well, let me ask you, when people people vote every day in this country. They vote several times a day. When you go into a store and buy something, you're voting. When you order food in a restaurant, you're voting. And when you vote that way, you're almost always getting what you voted for.
But not what they want. Nobody gets what they want in the market.
Of course they do.
They don't get all they want.
Of course not. The world is finite. But in terms of what you actually are getting, surely, when you go into a store and decide to buy a pound of potatoes, you get a pound of potatoes.
It's not clear when you buy a bag of potatoes what things you lose by purchasing that bag. I'm talking about the following kind of situation. The market, in fact, tracks the demand for particular goods. Is that not
absolutely
a claim that's uncontroversial at this table? If you use land to grow potatoes, you might give up the possibility of having sweet potatoes or whatever else.
Not at all. Not at all.
They vote for potatoes. It's not clear by the fact that they buy potatoes that they don't want sweet potatoes next week.
Maybe, but then they will for next week vote for sweet potatoes.
Not a sweet
potato.
potatoes.
The respect in which you have a valid point is if my purchase has effects on third parties, which I'm not able to compensate them for. If, for example, you are voting for more electricity by buying electricity, that leads to more smoke coming out of the chimney of the smokestack of the public utility company, and that dirties my shirt. Then you have a valid point that your action is imposing costs on me that I didn't agree to. But in the main, for things like potatoes and sweet potatoes, that problem is, in fact, not a major real problem at all.
When we make a collective political decision in a voting booth or in a general election, we're making a decision about how society should be. When we make a consumer decision, we don't care about how society should be.
Let's go to the first. No, we're actually making a decision that certain specific people shall have power. Now, as I've repeated several times, many times in various occasions, if I were to be sitting opposite an IRS inspector who is inspecting my tax returns, technically speaking, he's my servant and I'm the master. Which way, what would you feel about it? Which way would you feel if you were sitting in that position as a taxpayer, not as the IRS servant? In fact, what you are doing when you vote in the booth is transferring arbitrary power, largely arbitrary power in many cases.
Still rests in the lap of the voter. I mean,
The lap of how many voters?
I'm making a voluntary.
I beg your pardon. You're buying a whole package, some of which you want to buy and some of which you don't.
Right.
My claim is that when I go into the grocery store, if we're talking about me picking out the life I want and the goods I want, in order for me to make an informed decision about buying any particular product, I have to know exactly what market forces follow from me buying that product, and that's not clear from the purchase of potatoes.
You do not. You do not.
certainly
You are
do.
one. It's exactly the same as in the political booth. You're one vote in the political booth. You're one vote in the market. You're a very small vote in the market. The consequences of what you do are borne entirely by you. You have earned $1 by spending 5 minutes doing something, or 10 minutes, or whatever it is. And what you are doing is trading that 10 minutes of your time for the time of all the people who are involved in producing this 1 pound of potatoes. And there are essentially no further things you have to take into account.
I think we keep changing what's really a collective question, central planning, and putting it in individual terms, and I think we're warping the question when we do that.
Well, when you say it's a collective question, this comes back to the question of what you mean by collective. We have a society.
Right.
But that society is a collection of individuals. And fundamentally, I think what we're interested in is how these decisions affect individuals. Now, as members of a society, there are certain values we have in common, certain features of our total society that we benefit from or we are harmed by. Insofar as there's a wide measure of agreement about that, it's fine. Insofar as there are sharp differences, we would like to have a world in which people have as much freedom as possible to live their own kinds of style.
Yeah, obviously.
But I think it confuses things to think of collective as one thing or collective. There isn't one collective. There are people's connections with their church, people's connection with their family, people's connection with their local community, with the society as a whole. There are a whole hierarchy of these kinds of collective
Still, as a
groups.
nation, we move in directions. I think it's fair to say. And I think what Carol is saying is that when we buy potatoes and when everybody buys potatoes, we don't really think in what directions we're moving, and we move in whatever directions the market takes us.
The market doesn't take you anyplace. The market is a means and an instrument whereby we engage in deals with one another. We're the ones who are taking us. And fortunately, when we buy potatoes, we aren't moving society in one way or the other. All we're doing is providing an opportunity for people who want to grow potatoes to satisfy our desire for potatoes. And now, in fact, the market mechanism extends much beyond buying and selling. Now, buying and selling is a case where it is largely transactions among individuals. The fact that a group of people got together and set up, let's say, a nonprofit voluntary hospital, that was a collective action by a group of people. The Red Cross was a collective creation. That's as much a creation of the market, of individual transactions, as growing and selling potatoes. The crucial question in every case that I would bring to it is it voluntary? Are people free to join or not free to join?
I'm curious about your definition of freedom. And would you say somebody is free who has no money?
Absolutely. We don't want to confuse freedom and power. Let me give you a simple example. Robinson Crusoe is on an island. He is very, very poor.
Yes.
The island is a bad island. Would you say he's unfree?
Sure.
I wouldn't. I say he's poor. I think it's very important to use our terms to separate freedom, which I would interpret as having to do with relations among individuals. I would define freedom as the absence of coercion, and coercion as the use by one person of another person as his instrument, as a means rather than an end in itself. And I think it's important to distinguish freedom, which is an absence of coercion, from power, which is a capacity to command goods and services.
But
the person who doesn't have anything to eat. What?
Isn't poverty a coercion
No,
of the sort?
no. Coercion is always by people against people. Now, if I come, you have food, and I steal it from you, then I have coerced you, yes. That's why I give you the Robinson Crusoe case. He hasn't been coerced by anybody. He hasn't lost any freedom. He's very poor. He doesn't have much to eat, but he hasn't been coerced.
even accepting your definition of freedom, or to accept your definition of freedom, argues in favor of something which I'm not willing to concede. That is, it's under your analysis, the most important thing is that people, whatever the people do, they do voluntarily.
Absolutely.
I think I'm starting out from the position that I think it's the society I want to live in has people have the most equal endowment of certain kinds of material goods which aid fulfilling a particular career objective or the like.
And I guess I would be saying that that kind of society is immoral, and I think if you saw the results of it, you would feel it was immoral, because it would necessarily have to work to make people the same and to eliminate all of the differences among people, which are some of the things that we value the most.
And I would say that I want you both to be able to have your way. Because if you want to live in such a society, I think you ought to be able to live in such a society, but I don't think you ought to make him live in one. And the way to have that is by local self-government. You and people who feel like you should organize a community. There are communes in the United States that are organized exactly on that principle. You ought to be absolutely free to have them. You ought to be free to join them. The question is, I want you to be free to make Steve live in such a society if he doesn't want to. We are not saying that we want people to starve. We are saying that the kind of world we want is one in which we believe fewer people will starve, fewer people will have deficient housing and so on, but that's a byproduct and not the primary objective. The primary objective for me is a society in which there's a minimum of coercion of some people by other people, in which you have a maximum of freedom. Now, I happen to believe that historical evidence and analysis alike suggests that such a society will in fact be far more prosperous